Alright, so welcome to Into the Void episode 7. It's actually kind of getting up there, huh, Jshore?
7 is a pretty big number.
So we've covered some juicy topics so far. Any impressions based on what we've done so far? Anything intriguing, Jshore?
I'm horrible at force fields. Other than that, I've had pretty fun time with this. Except for force fields. We might have to revisit that in a year or two.
In a year or two. There will be plenty of time to revisit force fields. In fact, every time you look at a protoss ever, you're going to revisit force fields. Welcome to Into the Void episode 7. Mute my own stream. That would be good.
It probably would be, unless you want to send everyone into an infinite loop.
Infinite loops, yeah.
Infinite loop.
Alright, so today we're going to be talking about, we have a pretty interesting topic. Not so much gameplay going on this time. It's going to be a little bit more theory-based, talking about strategy, talking about specifics, and definitely a lot of juicy information for becoming a better gamer at playing Protoss. Maybe not necessarily the other race. But today we're going to be talking about camera control, in-depth specifics, all the stuff you want to know that you see players do but wonder why they're doing it is going to be discussed right now. So Jshore, real quick, top of your head, playing Protoss, what's your primary concern with moving your camera?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that unlike when playing as Terran or Zerg, you have to have insanely good control during battles because you cannot queue up and still micro the battle. So you've got to have good multitasking, swapping back and forth between warping in units and fighting, which adds a big element of difficulty to units that have to be microed or they just die.
Ah, good point.
So
didn't even think about that.
That's the first thing I think about.
I did not even think about that. Good point. Yeah, that's right. You could have Terran looking at the battle, stimming and A-moving, and using their hotkeys to queue up. Same thing with Zerg, actually, just queuing up the That's right. Unless you have your gateways, you're going to need to physically warp in, and that's every time. Even if you have a pylon near the battle, you still need to relinquish control over your army to warp in your units and then retake your army. That's a good point. Because unlike the Terran and Zerg players, you need to get your army to fight. They're queuing up and moving them, but you need to move your army wherever you warp them in and give them the commands to walk over and fight or position. Yeah, you're right. Good point. Before we jump right into the battles and going crazy and talking about that, let's start with the basics. Like, as soon as the game starts, like, what's your concern? It's going to be pretty, nothing crazy is happening. You're saying good luck, have fun. You don't have to worry yet about stim pack. It's nice and calm, and you're basically looking at your mineral line, right?
Yeah, the main thing early game is having good enough control to get your build order off without any huge errors, like completely forgetting a cybernetics core, which I may or may not do every so often, while scouting your opponent and swapping back and forth often enough to keep your probe alive and build stuff.
Right, it's definitely...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And just not forget anything.
Exactly. It's definitely important, as Jshore just said, not to let your probe die. A lot of players kind of scout their probes, which is perfect, but then they either you're going to lose it to like an SCV or a Marine or Zerglings. It's really important to pull that probe away and use it for a later time. Even past, I mean, it doesn't have much of a value. It's only 50 minerals, but that saves you time and that extra money. Before you go to do your rescout, you already have that probe in position. You can scout faster, more efficiently, and you don't need to pull another probe off of mining. Then, therefore, you'll have a higher increased income. So definitely cycling between that scouting probe and your nexus, which is definitely going to be very important. Remembering your build order, getting everything down without a hitch. That is going to take a little bit of control for the scouter, seeing what their opponent has, as well as getting your build order off, of course, on time is a challenge, not just getting your build order off. But what else past that, Jshore, is going to be important. Once you get your opening down, your probes out, you already scouted what you needed to see. Now are you kind of transitioning toward the early mid game? I like to call it.
I don't know. I mean, it's just like you have to have a good balance with everything. You can't just, you can't focus on one thing too much because you have to keep your eye on the mini-map. You have to, Minimap's a big thing. You can just notice with lower level players, you'll see a lot of really simple mistakes that could have been avoided because they had the time to put their camera there.
Right.
But when you get so caught up in trying to do one thing, you think, okay, I'm going to build my forge when I have 150 minerals. So you sit there for 5 seconds waiting for your money to come in when you could have been using that time to save the stalker at the watchtower or something like that. So it's really common to get caught up on something and, like, I don't know, forget the big picture of things while you're working on stuff.
Alright, great. You actually, perfect, well said. You actually mentioned two very hot topics that I would like to stress and even spend some time on individually. For a Protoss player, let's start with Xel'Naga Watchtowers. Now this is something, as I was actually trying to get out of you in the early to mid-game, Protoss kind of has a map control. They're usually the ones sitting on top of the Xel'Naga towers. In PvP, PvT, they'll have the Xel'Naga tower waiting for the Terran push to come out. Even in PvZ, up to the point where you get your first Zealot or two out, you can still take map control because Zerg is making drones, not going to be getting a ton of lings or roaches right away. Usually they just want a power drone first. So Protoss, being the race that can take that short period of the map control for about the first 5-6 minutes of the game, is kind of an advantage in that you're safe to perform your build. But in saying that, it is important, imperative even, to have good control and still utilize that map control. A lot of Protoss players, myself included, kind of suffer from not having map control due to being the race that kind of is forced into situations where you need the turtle. I mean, realistically speaking, Protoss probably the race that had the least amount of bases compared to TOS and Terran in the game. For example, Zerg is always going to have an extra base ahead of Protoss, meaning it's going to be a little bit less map control, map presence on the map, just logically. Same thing with Terran. Against the Terran player, you're not going to be into a game, watching a game, playing a game where Protoss has 3 bases and Terran has 2 bases, unless Terran's doing a 2-base all-in. Like in a macro game, Protoss is never going to have an extra base over Terran unless you're doing a fast expand, and that's an exception, for example. But yeah, it's pretty much suicide to ever have an extra base over Terran because usually Terran will just kill you. There's so many examples. I actually just saw one, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, and it was Nama versus I think JYP or something, and he took their base and kind of got SCV and even at like at the 20-minute mark, ironically. It wasn't like
wow.
Yeah, it was.
That's a lot of SCVs.
Oh yeah, it was like 60 SCVs, along with his entire army. So he had like Vikings, and it was like the mid-game 3-base. The standard two base Terran's gonna all in. It was just random too. Sent everything over. But yeah, map control is important because you don't want to, unlike Terran and Zerg, especially Zerg, whatever unit you keep at the Xel'Naga tower is probably going to be valuable, whether it be a Stalker, a Zealot, even a probe. Even in the sense that the probe's probably going to want a proxy later on. It's very hard to keep a probe on the map once you lose map control, especially again versus Zerg. If Zerg takes map control and you don't have a probe out, at least in the higher leagues, it's very, very difficult to sneak a probe away because most of the Zerg are always going to be using their lings and the overlords to be constantly scouting for that probe. So it's important to not lose anything at the Xel'Naga tower, and I can happily say that I've conditioned myself to always pay attention to Xel'Naga tower. So what my advice would be is at least keep whatever unit you send to the Xel'Naga tower, whether it be that probe, Stalker, Zealot, have him hotkeyed. Always have him looking around. Even check back with him. Even though you don't see anything in the minimap, I pay a lot of attention to the minimap, but I'm always still looking back at that unit itself while macroing. For example, I don't need to look at my Nexus to make a probe, so during the time I'm making a probe, I'll look quickly at the Xel'Naga tower. I'm not saying stare at him, not to spend your entire game there, but
you don't want like zoom in and watch him dance.
Yeah, zoom in, dance, cheer, but it's why is this important? I'll tell you why. Because you could just use your minimap, and that's perfectly fine. But there are players who slip up sometimes, and they end up losing X unit at moments like these. And this is actually a practice. The whole switching back to that unit is conditioning that I've used to kind of remind myself, to force myself to pay attention. Because it's easy to just hold a Xel'Naga tower for 4 or 5 minutes, and even if you don't lose a unit, you're not paying attention. That's the whole point.
Of having a watch
of having the watchtower to pay attention. And then you look back at the replay. Oh, where did this unit come from? And you'll feel like an idiot when you actually had vision of the entire thing, but you didn't notice it because you were too busy, I don't know, dancing with your probes or whatever X. Even if you were doing something good, you still missed it, and that's important. That's the logical part. That's the bigger picture, as mentioned in the whole scheme of things as being a Protoss player. I guess that's my whole spiel on Xanaga Towers, at least. Anything else you'd like to contribute toward that point?
I mean, just watchtowers are one of those things that are overlooked as just something you kind of want to have, but if the other person it's no big deal. It's no big deal. You can just kill the unit there, but the information they give is very, very valuable, and it's just something else that sets apart higher league players from lower league ones.
Definitely, you can't commence an attack on most maps without taking control of that Xanaga Tower or signaling you're moving out of your base or X. So, and then you could go into more strategies. For example, Terran's moving out with a huge army. He's going to pressure the Xanaga Tower. That's the key. If you're paying attention, that's the key to move your Warp Prism in and drop his main, because you know where his army is. It's at the Xanaga Tower now. And further, we can keep going from there in that direction, but that's more strategy based. We're going to talk strictly on camera and what we should be looking at. So the other thing you mentioned, Jshore, was the minimap. Now, of course, this is going to be a very hot topic for all of the races, granted. But Protoss, I couldn't agree more that it would be I would say there's no good player of Protoss because not using his minimap. Protoss is a race that needs it for two reasons. One, let's just say it. Let's be realistic here. Drops. Drops. Sure, and every race could get dropped, but the race that sucks the most and gets hit the hardest against drop, due to mobility, due to in-game factors that are already present, not just like a QQ threat or anything like that, is Protoss. They need to. I mean, if Zerg gets hit with a Terran medevac drop, they have fast speedlings. They just go, okay, he was out of position. He was in the middle of the map. Even if he takes a bit of fire, his army is so fast, especially on creep and it's his base, that he can get back there without taking extensive damage. That's not that punishing for a Zerg player who didn't spot a drop. Same thing with a Zerg player, a Terran player rather. If he gets hit with a Zerg drop or a Protoss drop, the way that Terran works for the most part is even though their army's out of position, whether or not they're close enough to stem and run in, which of course obviously is going to be another big mobility boost, but they also have a lot of units pumping out of their racks. In other words, it's continuous production. Not all of the same units from the racks are going to pop out all at once, and with that in mind, he's going to have one or two units to come out, and especially against Protoss at least, one or two units is usually enough to ward away a pretty big force from the Protoss player, able to stop him from doing significant damage until the rest of his forces can come back in, and he could just kite. So Protoss, being that race where if you did use a warp-in cycle and you don't have anything, if you're that kind of in that terrible spot, I feel like everyone's been in that spot and can relate to I remember that. It's a terrible feeling. You really need to pay attention to your drops, and even if you haven't used your warp-in cycle and you have it, by the time you use it, against a really good player, at least in the higher leagues, most of my references are going to go to geared toward a higher level of play, but can still be used in all levels, is you're still going to take extensive damage. No matter what. I can't stress this enough. Why? Because I've spotted drops and have taken extensive damage. If I don't spot the drop, I'm in that much more trouble. It's something that you need to do. There's no option. Maybe Zerg cannot spot the drop and be okay with it, but Protoss, you need to do that. And the best way to do this is two ways. And the first way I'm going to talk about now, since it relates to the minimap, the second one does not. Minimap. Very, very important control topic. Now, really quick, while talking about this, I have something I use. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's a very good Brood War trick, tactic, whatever you want to call it.
But he's going to try to describe it anyway.
I mean, I don't know what to call it. My personal overview of the entire game, the entire battle, is you always want to start